Hello and welcome to Timmy Mac Politics with me, Mr MacLellan. For this video we are going to focus on the significance of the national nomination conventions. And just a nod to the structure of this particular video, we are first going to complete an introductory contextual paragraph before getting on to the formal functions of the conventions and then looking at the informal functions of the conventions. And the key takeaway from this video has to be that the formal functions of the conventions has been reduced, whereas the informal functions, if any significance is to be found, it really is amongst these informal functions. Now, in terms of our introductory context, well, the first conventions were in the early 1830s, taken place by the Republicans and the Democratic parties. They do typically take place in July or August, although they have also been known to occasionally take place in September. But you're really looking for July or August for the conventions to take place. They are a traditional part of the national nomination campaigns, and therefore they do have historical significance. However, that significance has been diluted in the modern era. The candidate is coronated at the convention, so the chosen candidate for the Democrat or Republican parties is essentially anointed. They deliver an acceptance speech to the delegates in the hall, but also to the nation at large. Significantly now, a nod to the significant change that has taken place with the conventions in the modern era, and really the removal of the historical significance of the conventions has taken place around about from the 1970s and 1980s, where there has been a reduction in the formal historical role that the conventions have played. And therefore it's led to the accusation that the conventions are merely slick media events lacking in significance. But key to note is why the conventions have changed from their historical significance to their lack of significance relatively in the modern era. And it comes back to the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. And it's worth just paying some attention to the context in which this convention took place in the late 1960s for the Democratic Party in Chicago. The Vietnam War was still raging, civil unrest was taking place in America on a relatively large scale. Martin Luther King had been assassinated in April of that year. Robert Kennedy was to be assassinated in June of that year. So this really is a tumultuous period in the United States, politically and indeed socially speaking. And it's in that context that the 1968 Democratic Convention took place in Chicago. Now, because of the assassination of the leading figure in the Democratic nomination process, Robert Kennedy, it really blew the race for the Democratic nominee into the open. It became wide open, and it led to very much a contested, heated, turbulent, tumultuous convention in Chicago for the Democrats. And in an effort to try and gain some control over this process, the party bosses, those so-called party bosses in smoke-filled rooms, tried to influence the outcome of the convention in terms of choosing who the nominee would actually be. In the end, it was Hubert Humphrey who was given the award of the Democratic nominee for president, despite many protests and appeals in the convention hall for the voice of the party floor, if you like, to be given a greater say. It does seem that the sitting president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, and also the Chicago mayor, who was named Daley, had a significant role in hand-picking delegates who would then go on to vote a particular way at the convention. There was fighting on the floor of the convention, a few fisticuffs if you like, pushing and shoving was definitely observed, and really it just showed that the Democrats were a disunited party, not really fit to govern. And then what happened in the 1968 election? Well, the Democrats lost. So in an effort not to repeat that, the Democrats set up the McGovern-Fraser Commission. It was first led by Senator George McGovern, and then later Donald Fraser, Representative Donald Fraser, who took over the commission, and it led to the McGovern-Fraser reforms, which in essence led to a reduction in the influence of party bosses in terms of their role when it came to choosing candidates for the nomination. Now it is much more of an open process, going through state by state, which you should be familiar with in terms of the primaries and the caucuses take place and where the candidates accrue delegates, so that we essentially know who the nominee for president is going to be before the convention takes place. That has had a significant impact in terms of how significant the convention is, but it has avoided a repeat of the chaos of the 1968 Democratic Convention. Now on to then the formal functions of the convention, which really have been significantly lost as a result of the McGovern-Fraser reforms. Some people would argue that it's a sad loss that the convention is no longer as vigorous as it used to be. However, others will argue that the interest is retained over a longer period of time going through the primaries and caucuses from each state. So, formal functions. Well, it's worth noting here, both for the formal and informal functions, the 3 Ps. It's a good way to remember it, 6 in total, but 3 for the formal functions. They are presidential candidate, choosing the vice presidential candidate. I know there's a V there, but I'm still going to focus on that P. And then deciding upon the party platform. So remember the 3 Ps. Presidential, vice presidential candidate, and deciding the party platform. Now, in terms of choosing the presidential candidate, it does mark a formal end of the nomination process, and that is a key staging post for the national nomination conventions. They mark the end of the nomination process and the start of the national general election campaign. A delegate majority is required by a candidate to win. The totals are quite interesting, and do bear in mind that the figures are different in terms of the Democratic and Republican totals for their delegates. In 2020, the Republican had a total of 2,550 delegates up for grabs. A majority is needed to win for one particular candidate. The Democrats, in contrast, had 4,749 delegates up for grabs. And that really does show that the primaries and caucuses and the conventions, as held by the Democratic and Republican parties, they're separate from each other. They are done differently, and a stark indicator of that is the number of delegates who are up for grabs. Also, another key difference as well, please note here that the Democrat Party has super delegates. Everything's super in the United States, isn't it? They have their super delegates. In 2020, there were 775 of these. And this is really an attempt by the party bosses trying to re-exert their influence somewhat to actually have a bearing on the outcome. Because the delegate totals here, most of these delegates, all of them in fact for the Republican Party, are committed or pledged delegates. They should vote according to the wishes of their state. And the wishes of their state, of course, are communicated through the primary and caucus process that has been gone through right up into the convention. You do have Democratic superdelegates, though, who are unpledged or uncommitted delegates. They can vote for a candidate who they like. They can vote according to their own conscience, not following the wishes of a particular state. They haven't significantly affected the outcome, however, okay? It's just a re-exertion of the influence of party bosses within the Democratic Party, but really it hasn't had much of a consequential effect in terms of the races that have been run. Their existence, in fact, is a response to Carter in 1980 and McGovern 8 years earlier in 1972, suffering heavy defeats. And I think the Democratic elite got a little bit nervous that the right candidate was not being chosen to beat the Republicans, and therefore they've inserted a measure of control through their superdelegates, 775 of them in 2020. The result, however, much more often than not, in fact, nearly always, is a foregone conclusion. Now, that didn't used to be the case historically with the conventions, but now it is, because you just need to do the sums as you go through the primaries and caucuses in each state, and candidates pick up more delegates. You win Florida, you win California, you accrue more delegates, you do the maths, and therefore you know who is in the lead. And by the time the convention comes round, well, the result is known. You know who is going to be the nominee, and therefore the result really is a foregone conclusion. You don't have that nervous wait, that exciting wait as to who is going to be the chosen one at the convention. It is already known, okay? Exceptions to that, there are a couple of exceptions, but this is rare, of course. Gerald Ford in 1976 achieved the nomination, beating Ronald Reagan by a mere 60 delegates. So that was quite close. Obama in 2008. Now, it wasn't so close for Obama in 2008, but there was a bit of a suspicion that superdelegates could have sided with Hillary Clinton en masse, denying him the nomination. But that didn't happen, as it turned out, and he won relatively comfortably, okay? It wasn't a home run, far from it, but the superdelegates didn't en masse go for that more establishment candidate, as may have been suspected, in the form of Hillary Clinton. Obama portraying himself a bit more of an outsider in the 2008 election, and arguably may have made some of the superdelegates a little bit nervous. I suppose he was such a good candidate that didn't come to pass in the end, okay? But in the main, yeah, it's a foregone conclusion. If you don't have a majority, and this rule is still in place though, if no candidate has an overall majority, it becomes a brokered convention, and that means the delegates can operate as free agents. They are no longer committed or pledged delegates. They don't have to necessarily follow the wishes of their state. They can vote for who they like, and indeed a new candidate can actually enter the race. But in the modern era, it has never happened. Just as an example of that, between 1892 and 1952, 50% of conventions were brokered conventions, with no candidate securing an overall majority. That has not happened since 1952, however, which just shows you, doesn't it, the level of excitement when it comes to the conventions has significantly dropped. They are now, therefore, ratifying bodies having been deliberative bodies. They used to be places of real political debate. That is no longer the case. They really are ratifying or rubber stamping bodies for decisions that have been made previously, namely by the voters in the state for Republicans and Democrats, and voting for their favoured candidates. As I say, the result is often known. And the best way really to characterise the conventions today is that they are, in essence, stage-managed political theatre. Good example of that is that John McCain actually effectively secured the nominee. He was that far ahead in the Republican primaries contest. He secured it roughly in March 2008, so well before the July-August Republican convention of that year. Very much a coronation of rubber stamping, effectively what everyone already knew in terms of who the candidate was going to be. Moving on to the next formal function, the selection of the vice presidential candidate. And this is where the so-called balance ticket will be on show for the first time. You will have the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate on show in front of the world's media for the very first time. And that does lead to an increase in scrutiny, most notably for Sarah Palin in 2008, as chosen by John McCain. Now, John McCain, he was behind in the polls at the time, so he went a little bit left field, if you like, in selecting Sarah Palin. She was untested, unheard of, but re-energised the campaign. However, the increased scrutiny that was on Sarah Palin, in the end, it really did leave her being found wanted in terms of her political abilities and her knowledge, quite frankly, of the political landscape. So in the end, it probably backfired, but I think most commentators could understand why McCain did it, to re-energise what was at the time really a losing campaign. It didn't work, it probably backfired, but it does highlight the increased scrutiny that will be on that balance ticket, the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate for the first time. Unfortunately though, in terms of excitement, it hasn't been since 1988 that Dan Quayle was selected as the vice presidential candidate actually at the convention. Normally now it is known beforehand, similar to the selection of the presidential candidate. So the vice presidential candidate has gone the same way as the presidential candidate. It is known beforehand. Dan Quayle will be the last time that it was announced at the convention. And a good example of that is that Biden was announced by Obama in 2008 via a text message beforehand. So it's released to the media beforehand rather than the surprise coming at the convention itself. It's all about media management today, far removed from the historical functions of the convention. And then finally, in terms of formal functions, the party platform is decided. Now, a party platform, not like a more detailed manifesto in the context of UK politics, merely a set of principles known as policy planks as decided by the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee, the party establishment. They don't go into as much detail, but within that, the party faithful is engaged in terms of what the principles or planks of the party should be. However, these planks are not seriously debated, they are not binding, and they are rather vague. So some people would question as to the level of substance that these party platforms actually have. However, let's not dismiss them totally, because you can identify both intra and inter-party differences when it comes to their party platforms. So disunity is always a thing that viewers and the media are looking out for at these conventions. Can you detect any disunity in amongst the parties? That would be the intra-party differences, and that can be highlighted by any sort of debate that does take place regarding the party platform. Of course, as well, you can identify inter-party differences, those differences between the Democrat parties and the Republican parties, normally on those so-called wedge issues like abortion and like on gun control, as an example. In terms of intra-party differences, the differences within the parties, well, really it comes down to how far left does the Democrat Party go and how far right does the Republican Party go. And just examples of that, you have in recent years a left-wing insurgency as led by Bernie Sanders, in particular in the Democratic Party. Key debate from the 2016 convention was the implementation of a federal minimum wage. The Democrats go for that, whereas in the Republican Party, how socially conservative should they be? So that's where you can get some interest in the party platforms, although it is relatively muted. It has to be said in the grand scheme of things. And that then brings us on to the informal functions of the conventions. And this is really where the significance of the modern conventions lies. And again, remember your 3 Ps. We are looking at party unity, potential voters, and a poll bounce that the candidates can benefit from in terms of a successful convention. When it comes to party unity, we've already mentioned it, but new information, if you like, coming your way here. In essence, the political parties in the United States, Republicans and Democrats, they are 50 state-based parties that come together to form a national campaign once every 4 years. So, 50 state-based parties coming together once every 4 years to have that sense of unity. And at a more personal level, you will get people from all around the United States, politically minded people, politically similar, and they get to kind of speak to each other in face, in person to person. Once again, doesn't happen often. They no doubt get a little bit excited by that, but again, that is really an informal function rather than one of the formal functions that we've addressed. Key endorsement should really be made at the convention, where the chosen presidential candidate receives the endorsement of their rivals, and that typically happens. So, for example, in 2008, Clinton endorsed Barack Obama after a fierce and vicious nomination battle, relatively close. Historically speaking, Clinton did publicly endorse Obama, strengthening party unity. Sanders, similarly, in 2016, endorsed Clinton after a very fierce and personal primary race there. However, it is not always the case that an endorsement comes to pass, and in recent years we've got the example of Ted Cruz refusing to endorse Trump in 2016. So conventional wisdom says that if you get the endorsement from your rivals, in essence it heals the wounds and improves the electoral prospects of the chosen candidate and the party at large. However, Ted Cruz famously refused to endorse Donald Trump in 2016. Did it harm Donald Trump's electoral prospects? Well, not to the extent where he lost the election, because of course he won in 2016. Donald Trump, convention defying, who would have thought it? Okay, it wasn't the first and it wouldn't have been the last time either that he's defied political convention. Potential voters, appealing to them then, if you have that sense of party unity, unless you're Donald Trump, you are going to try and appeal to potential voters. And really you are looking to engage in a national effort to win multiple elections. And when I say multiple elections, it is always worth dropping into any answer that you acknowledge that in the United States during a presidential election year there also takes place congressional elections for the Senate and the House of Representatives, and also state-based gubernatorial elections for state legislatures, city mayors. It goes on and on, constant electioneering in the United States. So you really want to engage potential voters for that national effort to win as many elections as you can. Don't forget your federalism and the separation of powers. Drop that in, why not? Which creates all of these elections, constant electioneering. So if you're going to have a national effort to try and secure as many victories as you can, you are going to engage in a significant ground war, which requires a lot of foot soldiers. And to make sure you have enough foot soldiers to win this ground war, you need to energize the party base. So that is one of the key informal functions of the convention. Candidates therefore speak not only to the convention hall but also to the nation. The people who can't be there but are watching at home, maybe reading the newspapers, listening to the radio, you need to engage as many people as you can through, of course, the media. So that is one of the key things that they will try and do. Good examples of trying to do that, the sound bites that they use. MAGA, Make America Great Again, works so effectively for Donald Trump, and the essence of hope and change. Yes, we can for Barack Obama in 2008. Very much a nod, not just to those people in the convention hall, but those people who are also sitting at home. Now, interestingly, celebrities can help you secure potential voters, but they can also hinder your chances too. I suppose it depends on how well the celebrity lands in the convention hall and with viewers at home. They can be found very commonly at Democratic conventions. Bruce Springsteen, Bono often features at a Democratic convention. However, it can backfire. Now, examples I've plucked out. We've got Scarlett Johansson in 2012 for the Democrats, probably appealing, in fact she did appeal to young Democratic voters to actually turn out and vote. She didn't actually explicitly say vote Democrat, she just wanted them to actually get out and vote. You know, your 20-something voters who are a little bit less secure in terms of will they turn out or not. And she did quite an effective job, deliberately placed in the convention hall to actually encourage young people to turn out. Quite clever from the Democrats. They know that if young people turn out, they're much more likely to vote Democrat. In contrast, Clint Eastwood appeared in the 2012 Republican convention, really to, I suppose, symbolise the gunslinging frontier man that he is. He's a sort of star of Western movies, the sort of person who appealed to Republican voters. Dislike of authority, in this essence of being told what to do, making your own way in the world, as so many cowboys tend to do in Western movies. But he really flopped. It was quite a bizarre convention speech for Clint Eastwood, who was, well, I think in his 80s at the time, and his age really did come across not inspiring, not energetic, and in the end one felt rather squeamish watching him, a bit uncomfortable and a little bit nervous for how he was getting on. It didn't really land well at all for Clint Eastwood and the Republican Party. That said, more celebrities do appear for the Democrats. Doesn't seem to worry the Republicans too much because, of course, that strengthens their argument that the Democrat Party really are the party of the so-called coastal elites. Hollywood, essentially, which is far removed from the lives of ordinary people. Finally, the location of the conventions is interesting because they are strategically located, often in key swing states, to try and pick up as many potential voters, of course, as possible. So in 2016, the Democrats chose to locate their convention in Pennsylvania, and the Republicans chose to locate their convention in Ohio. Worked to a greater extent for the Republicans. They won Ohio. Didn't work too well for the Democrats because they actually lost Pennsylvania in 2016. So there's no hard and fast rules to this, but there is an element of strategic thinking, and therefore the significance, informally speaking, of the conventions can be found there. Final informal function of the national nomination conventions, the candidates do pick up somewhat of a poll bounce, around about, averagely speaking, about 6%. For candidates of the Republican and Democrat parties, okay? It is a 3 to 4 day celebration, jamboree, showcasing the best of the parties and attacking rivals without really allowing them to have a response in amongst those 3 or 4 days. So it would be a little bit surprising if they didn't get any poll bounce at all. Of course they should do. However, the poll bounce can be short-lived, as shown by these two examples here. In 2008, McCain benefited more than Obama in terms of the poll bounce, yet lost. In 2016, Clinton, this time, benefited more than Trump in terms of the poll bounce, and yet lost. So the poll bounce, it has to be seen into context. What is the starting position of these candidates? Where does the bounce take them to? But how long can it sustain itself? And the conventions take place a good few months before the November election. So that enthusiasm can die out. Final line here, conventions are now a media ritual. These formal functions have been greatly diminished. Yes, there is informal significance to be found, but it is based around the media, hence the media ritual that the conventions are. And really showing the reduced significance of the conventions is that coverage by the major networks and therefore consequently viewing figures are in long-term decline. I think there was quite a large audience for Donald Trump's convention, no surprise there, but they are in long-term decline. Kind of highlights that their significance has been greatly diminished. Hope that was useful as ever. Thank you very much for watching.